Okay, hello everybody, and Nino, good morning, good afternoon. I think you're coming to us from your home in Hawaii, no doubt.
That's right. Good to see you again, Carlos.
Greetings. I'm taking your son in here from home in Bangkok. This is the Long Game Asia podcast. We are two industry veterans who are here to share with our audience our decades of experience in private equity in Asia and the unique aspects of that asset class of investment and really the mechanics of managing deals and portfolios across the region. And for sure, some interesting and fun stories along the way is inevitable in this topic. Today, we're going to talk about boards of directors, which are the governance vehicle for companies in general, and certainly for financial sponsor-led businesses, they're a very important function. And I think we're going to talk about a number of aspects, ranging from the board chairman, the membership, meetings, and compensation, et cetera, et cetera. So, before I kick off, and anything you want to hear up front?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm looking forward to getting into this. I think this is what our second formal content laden episode, and I think it's good that we're getting to boards as early, in this kind of library of podcasts, just because it's so foundational, I guess, to how we thought about adding value as a GP to our investments. I think there's maybe as we get into this, we'll find that it's a pretty universal topic. I think obviously, in the West, boards are widely instituted. I think in Asia, we were kind of cutting against the grain a little bit with boards, and in particular, the idea of bringing in a board chair. And many CEOs, in my experience, sort of found that threatening.
Yeah, I'm gonna hold your thunder there, because that is a juicy topic to dig into, is the CEO and the chairman dynamic. But you're absolutely right. And actually, the more broad point, I do want to. We didn't set it out in the agenda per se, but let's face it. So many of the companies we acquire are family businesses that it was inconceivable they had a board, because the founder was just the board and make all the decisions, top and bottom. So even just the institutionalization of any kind of board is a big discontinuity. So I'm very interested in your thoughts on that. Maybe we start with the board chairman themselves, and I'll kind of throw in my 2 cents on what I think kind of works and what doesn't work. I mean, first of all, I am. In contrast to listed boards, especially listed boards in the West, where you so often see chairman, CEOs who are also playing the role of chairman, I think it's a terrible idea. Generally in private equity, and certainly in Asia, especially when the CEO is an incumbent who is the founder of the business. So I have a strong bias against that. I think a better model is recruiting an independent ex-CEO from the industry. But somebody who is sort of an age, and I can think of some specific examples, but of an age that they're just not going to be threatening. They're clearly in a retirement mode, and they're just kind of the, Yoda type of mentor and type of individual. And then I think you had mentioned sort of profiles, because different board chairman character or personality or role for different types of situations. I have some thoughts about that. I got my list, but maybe you can go first or share what you think about the chairman versus the CEO role.
Yeah, so I guess in terms of role, and then does it make sense to think about it in terms of role first, and then the kind of profiles that the time so starting with the concept of the role, I guess. For us, kind of the anchoring point. Well, we went through a real transition as a GP. This was in about 2015, when kind of value creation suddenly became much more front and center in our program. And we'd always been working on it, but it had been largely kind of the deal teams that were really kind of quarterbacking the value creation. We had a small but growing number of kind of operating partners and advisors kind of in orbit. And then we kind of, we kind of made a decision at a GP level that we were going to really institutionalize a lot of value creation. And one of the decisions we made as part of that initiative was we were going to have boards in all of our portfolio companies. There was going to be board chairs who were independents, who nominally independent, but who were not the deal lead, certainly not the CEO. And around that transition point, we sat down. We had an offsite in Palo Alto, as I recall. Anyway, and kind of documented what it was that we wanted the board chair to be. And top of that list was this notion that. So at one point somebody proposed, the board chair should be effectively the line manager of the CEO. And that concept generated a lot of allergic reaction because, CEOs, they're not the type to want to sign up for a typical line manager type situation. And so the way we formulated it and what I think worked better, because at the core of that is a concept that is important. The CEO reports to the shareholder. But effectively what the shareholder is doing is carving out and delegating the day-to-day management of the board and therefore the CEO to this INEC, independent non-executive chair. And so that was the first role, was in a delegated fashion, represent the shareholder to kind of bring that management of the CEO to a single focal point. And that was the core of the role. And then in addition to that, there were additional, we want the board chair to be effectively a coach to the CEO, to be a manager of the board, and so to manage the other directors. And then finally, I would say to be kind of the conduit of coherent, distilled, actionable input from the shareholder to the CEO. Those were kind of the key anchor points, I guess, that we defined.
On that one, Nino, I mean, it's interesting because there's a lot of CEOs will have this tendency of being just paranoid about their authority and their autonomy and this line manager concept. I can appreciate the allergic reaction. But, there's an opportunity here for chairman to kind of play the psychology game and get on side with the CEO in the following sense that you mentioned, which is inevitably, and we've all seen this, especially in the first year, there's kind of an inundation of information requests of various kinds from the sponsor, very often at relatively junior levels, and people just doing kind of what they're told, and kind of bogging down the business in all kinds of data requests. And to the extent that the chairman could be kind of an advocate to manage and channel and prioritize such things, and in that sense, find common cause and fraternity with the CEO, that can be helpful.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. It's almost like, it's a bridge with, lanes running both ways in that advocate role. And so finding a seasoned, somewhat wizened, I guess, figure who both speaks management and speaks sponsor, who's had familiarity with both worlds, I think is really helpful.
Indeed. And, we talk about profiles and I actually, what you had described, I had thought about as providing resource leverage for the sponsor, as that's how I interpreted it. And then, there's the CEO mentor. I mean, occasionally I have seen before CEOs who have the wisdom, and of course the chairman has to have a certain personality and style, that they actually seek, that mentorship, in a positive and productive way. But setting those roles aside, I think that occasionally, look, we've both seen, we've installed outside CEOs, forget about the incumbent, outside CEOs who have some, obviously have leadership experience running some big part of a business and maybe from an adjacent industry, but not really long in that industry. And having, that gets nicely counterbalanced with somebody who could have a industry strategy perspective and has, a deep set of networks and certainly will help in the M&A agenda. That's another profile and a kind of a need. And then just keep, going along those lines, customer door opener. So very often, CEOs, again, if they're coming from not immediately that industry, having somebody who has that, customer in this sort of B2B type of industries, that is valuable as well. And others I can think of it. I'll just pause there.
Yeah, no, it's you touch on, I think, a thread. There's a thread there that I want to tug on a little bit. I think there was a bit of a pendulum swing in the way that we talked about this. On the one hand, certainly at the outset of this initiative, we were like, let's get absolute industry, insiders, people who are ideally, have a brand of their own within the industry, are known entities or have a certain cachet within the industry, both for, credibility within the organization, also with the customer base, like you said. On the other, I also remember there was a strong argument to be made that it's so hard to find these board chairs who are able to play that bridge role really adeptly, and where I think we kind of wound up was a place where we said the board chair, even if they aren't necessarily total industry insiders, I mean, they might have B2B experience if they're running boards in B2B sectors, or they might be more consumer facing type CEOs, but sort of dialing in greater detail than that was often counterproductive because they were then structurally more in competition with the CEO, but mainly because if you get somebody who is, you're overweighting the selection based on those types of sector type factors, you're often underweighting kind of the service based leadership kind of orientation that an effective chair needs to have. And so the way we wound up, if I think about our most successful deals, we had a chair who had actually been a chair with us in prior deals and knew how we worked as a sponsor and really understood the role they could play as a chair. And what we would then do is surround that chair with independent directors on the board or other advisory talent that bring that hyper-specific sector expertise. And we found that to be, so we found the ability to deploy chairs across multiple deals to be really just additive in terms of how we were growing as a sponsor and just being serially more effective.
Yeah, and I think I want to toggle to the broader discussion about membership and different kind of roles there, and that I think is relevant when we think about industry advisors and whatnot. What I would say is, your point is well taken that you could kind of over optimize industry experience, for example, in a way that is threatening or confusing for the CEO. It just depends on the situation, and it depends on the personal dynamics. I can think of a situation on a certain spirits industry transaction where we actually bought a super heavy hitter global luminary in that industry, but specifically because our ambition was to sell the business, which had been focused on a local market in Southeast Asia, sell it to an international player. And this guy had the ultimate Rolodex in the industry for that purpose. So he was fit for purpose, and we actually made that trend. At exit within less than 2 years. That was maybe a special case, but still, that individual and the CEO had a good mutual respect, and the personalities clicked. So, I think it's you could be too clever by half in terms of getting something long in the tooth in the industry.
There's something I wanted to ask you before we transition to that next, I guess, the broader membership how you compose the board. One of the roles that became that we actually sort of broke the glass on a couple of occasions was, the idea of the board chair being kind of like an emergency parachute CEO in case the existing CEO, for whatever reason, like catastrophically doesn't work out, and you're not able to do kind of like an orderly transition. And so you've got this kind of intermediate period. And we had a couple of cases where the board chair kind of stepped in as kind of like acting CEO for a period of maybe 6 months or so. And I don't know. That became kind of like an expectation that we always had with our chairs, that should the need arise, that they were prepared to make that incremental sort of commitment in terms of time and energy. How did you guys think about that?
The last full measure of devotion. We had that situation before, but I don't know that it was. Maybe it was implicitly assumed that could be a scenario, but it was more of a, kind of a sudden change, and it was natural that the chair would step up into an executive. I think we called him executive chairman, but only on a temporary basis. We ended up recruiting a CEO because they didn't want to play that role long term.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you can't beat the understudy, ready, chairman model. Again, if they come from the industry in a senior role, that's always better than having a deal partner as a CEO. Although I've had the deal partner as CEO that situation one time. It worked like a charm. But that's something for another day. Thinking about the broader membership question, I think, and speaking of deal guys, and I dearly love, and I've always seen my colleagues who were on I'll call it the deal side as really the partners and clients that I serve. But I do find that in terms of board membership, there's certainly a habit or kind of a habit of appointing this sort of the next level of juniors onto a board, giving them some board experience for the first time in their life. We're talking like VPs who are 34 years old, which is I think that's not a complete crime. I think that for the right type of person, it is a good experience to have them, and I think you can do that once. You don't want to like populate half the board with a bunch of pimply faced young people who have no experience on boards and no industry experience and no experience in doing anything other than running an Excel model. So one thing to think about is just in general, having INED, independent non-executive directors, appointed. Do you have one? Do you have more than one? Are they folks who are in your advisory network, or they could be folks like who are have industry experience like you and I, who are already insiders. So there's different roles for that. But there's also related to them, before I let you weigh in, there's this kind of observer. And I think we've both seen situations where board, just the population of people showing up at board meetings keeps growing. You have this kind of, we used to call it in New York, strap hanger effect of everybody just sort of showing up and being a board observer. And that happens on the management side. Is very often the CEO likes, for whatever reason, to invite his direct reports to the board meeting and or, on the deal side. So I think that there has to be some, discipline. You can have observers, and sometimes I've seen boards where the CFO was not a board member, but it's not negotiable that you would not have a CFO at all the board meetings. So that's a natural observer role. But I guess my main point on this observer wider question is be thoughtful and deliberate about who's actually there and what role they're supposed to be playing, and do they have a lane where they're actually contributing meaningfully to the discussion? Or are they just there, consuming time and oxygen? So anyway, just a broader throw up the discussion on membership and professionals and non-professionals and observers and et cetera. Your thoughts?
Yeah. So I think I certainly saw the the tendency, like I said before, that sort of milestone moment where we said we're going to get intentional, about how we think about board construction. And prior to then, boards were, really kind of the CEO, maybe the CFO, depending on the jurisdiction. I mean, Japan always has to have the CFO on the board, I guess. But then other than that, it was just like the entirety of the deal team, that had worked on the deal, and everybody gets their epaulette or whatever, their little badge of board membership. We then said, we want to be very judicious about how we use these board seats and really try and ensure that there's a clear understanding of what each director is bringing to the table. So the deal lead, I think, clearly is part of that triumvirate of deal lead, board chair, CEO. That's kind of like the board within the board almost. And then around that, you've maybe got some independents, possibly operating partners, advisors who are clearly aligned with like one or more like key value creation lever. So for instance, if a big part of the value is going to be unlocked by, AI applications, in some part of the business, and that's not necessarily muscle tissue that is like, widespread in the business. That's a key thing that we would typically use a director, like an outside director for. The point on observers is interesting, I guess. Yeah, the way we kind of threaded the needle there was, for like the monthly P&L review, or some of the deep dive sessions into, how is our whatever cross-border strategy into China going. Not a bad idea to have the management team and maybe, more members of the, of the deal team present for that. And they're not necessarily contributing in the form of questions or discussion, but it just it creates this kind of flatness of communication about like, what's the status and what are we doing? But we were always careful to carve out director only sessions where we got into some, potentially more sensitive topics or where voting, was needed to decide a direction. So just having this, I guess the way we thought about the discipline point that you made was what belongs in the directors only session as opposed to kind of the open board meeting. And then the point about the management, I mean, I was always partial to the idea of, not having, ideally you'd have the one management seat, which was the CEO seat, also sitting on the board. Because to your point, for pretty much the entirety of the session, the CFO will be there, will be driving perhaps, the finance reviews. For a lot of the discussion, it's good to have the head of HR typically around. Business unit heads, need to be there, but you don't need to dilute, kind of the precious number of board seats that you have to give all those folks their own seats. And it creates kind of a weird executive, non-executive power of balance or balance of power sort of struggle if you have too many executives who are also, deputized as directors.
Well, I would, I think it's almost never good practice, in my view, of having director roles occupied by managers other than the CEO and maybe the CFO. But it's more like the kind of the strap hanger effect. And I saw it a lot in Japan and Korea in particular, where you'd have like all the direct reports would be there, but they wouldn't say a word in the meeting. They'd just be listening, taking notes. And I find that, I don't find it adds any value fundamentally. But I mean, it goes back to just the degree of formality and discipline. I'm sure we've seen the whole gamut, but some basics that you want to have in a board. You want to have a board chairman who runs the meeting. God knows we've seen situations where even that role is not defined. And I know we talked about the board chairman, but that's not uncommon in especially in GPs that are relatively new to buyout. They don't really think in a very deliberate way about the board and about having a board with a board chairman and a set of meeting frequency and agendas for those and people who are accountable for those agendas and follow up to those things. And then we'll get into more of the mechanics of the board in a second. But, I don't know. I have a bias towards not formality, but towards, I guess, accountability and definition and thoughtfulness about boards. Because otherwise they just become kind of like, a club for people to have fun. And that's very distracting, I think, for CEOs and management. So, so let's talk about the meetings themselves. I mean, I think there's different, so here we're talking about, what's the scope of the agenda? What's the frequency of the meeting? What are the musts that a board must weigh in on? And how long should meetings be? And board materials and minuting of boards, all these type of topics. I mean, I have thoughts on all of them, but I guess one thing I'd say is there's probably, again, depends on the business. I mean, I've seen if a business is not in crisis, I think it's having a proper board meeting of 2 to 4 hours or a half day every quarter is fine. And then typically at a monthly level, you have a kind of just a purely financial review on the P&L for the previous month and how cash is going and things like that. I think that actually works pretty well. I mean, but I've seen also monthly board meetings. I saw in one case a business that was in severe distress where the board was meeting a couple times a week. It was in just absolute firefighting mode. And I think that was important. And I think I would submit and then get your reaction to when it comes to the agenda. There's probably 4 pieces of an agenda that you want to have generically, right? So one is, and I believe minuting can be a little bit overly formal, but I think there's a benefit in reflecting back, actually capturing what was decided and discussed and decided in the board meeting and seeing if there's any comments on that in the subsequent board meeting. And that can usually be dispensed with quickly. But then the core, then financial review, it's essential and that'd be very meaningful. We can talk about how detailed that gets. Rotating topics and then special topics. What I mean by rotating topics is I found in the number of boards having some like functional review, and it depends on the business. It could be supply chain or sales operations. Geographic review. The business has different strong geographic poles, or business unit product/business unit reviews. Having a certain cadence where, depending on the business and the function or business unit, you would actually have the principal responsible for those areas to present at some frequency, and maybe it's just twice a year or even once a year. But you actually lay that out, and that's what I call the rotating topics, where you actually pre-program those reviews, which is a great way of the board actually observe next level management, and not just sitting in a meeting taking notes, but actually presenting in their lane. I think that's a great process. And then the fourth bucket, I say, special topics, things that crop up that need to be addressed at a board level. I think those are the 4 kind of essential generic kind of areas. Your thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, so I think first of all, in terms of like the meeting cadence, I think I was thinking like the resting heart rate sort of status was very much in our case as well. It was the once a month, typically done, with many of the participants being remote. Once a month you do the regular review around how the business is doing. And 1 to 2 hours is about right there. And then once a quarter, the kind of ideally face-to-face or predominantly face-to-face, where you have a half day or maybe even a full day where you cover, like a quarterly review, a bit more of a formal, how are we doing check-in. And then you leave time for a couple of those kind of, we used to call them deep dive sessions, or those.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a better word. Yep.
And then ideally, wherever you are doing that face-to-face session, some form of engagement between the board and kind of like the locally relevant management. So there might be a dinner or some way of kind of, putting a bit more of a interhuman dimension to the board, and interacting a bit more with kind of the broader team. And then, as you say, when things are in some sort of a crisis mode, at that point, obviously, you need to tailor the cadence to the nature and kind of the extremity of the crisis. But to be determined as circumstances warrant. I think the point about deep dive topics is really interesting, and I think that it's essential. I think that to me, best practice, the way I came to think of best practice was the deep dives are great. Even better is when they're explicitly linked to like the underwrite and the value creation plan. So that, of that list of sort of 5 big sort of, curve bending, sort of trajectory altering initiatives that we're going to pursue, that once a quarter we check in on how 1 or 2 of those are doing and really drill in beyond kind of like the P&L impact, but really drill into kind of like, what's the strategy? What are we doing? What are the metrics? What is the talent, behind this initiative, and how are we organizing for it? We really kind of do a, kind of like a full on dissection, of that pillar of the value creation plan. Because otherwise what I found would happen was that you would wind up, the board would wind up becoming a little touristy in the form of, well, let's have a look at what's happening in our division in Australia or whatever. But if it's not central to like how we're incrementally adding value and how it leads to our eventual exit, right? Like you want to avoid these deep dive topics straying too far from just that central thesis.
Yeah. I agree. That's why I would sort of segregate and call them different things. But the deep dive a good example is, M&A, which is first of all, it's another reason to actually have a much more limited audience board, because these are very sensitive topics. But that's a topic that if there is an M&A agenda, let's say on the buy side, that has to be discussed at some interval in depth as it percolates along. When I mentioned about this, sort of functional reviews, they can be a little bit garden variety, if you will. And I think their main purpose is really a showcasing of the talent in the organization and giving everybody an opportunity to have a day in the sun, and it may be just once a year, but there's no harm in that.
Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, I mean, I guess there should be no part of the business that isn't touched by that core value creation plan. Otherwise, why is it part of the business? Kind of. So, So I guess you could say that, I mean, when you do these functional reviews or whatever business unit reviews, and I think they do play the role that you talked about, kind of giving visibility to and giving visibility of people in the organization to the board, and giving as much of the organization some degree of access to or ability to interact with the board. But again, to sort of tie everything back to the exit case, and how we're planning.
And I cross myself.
Yeah, that's right.
The most essential. Underwriting, value creation, exit. Let's not forget about budgets. When I say that, I mean maybe more proper annual operating plan, but fundamentally, the board certainly has a fiduciary role to discuss and approve, a budget and sort of targets. They're related to the underwriting, they're related to compensation, and they are get reviewed as variance against plan. So that's something that has to happen at or before or shortly thereafter, the beginning of the fiscal year. That's pretty non-negotiable. I think having a kind of away day, maybe every 2 years or every 3 years, where there's a much more in-depth kind of strategy discussion, retreat offsite type of thing has merit. It's going to use some of the board's time. So
that's a good point. I think we had a couple of businesses that kind of had this model in place, and we as a sponsor really kind of very happily sort of signed up for it. The idea was that you have kind of that strategy offsite as really one of the key inputs to the budget setting discussion. So
exactly.
Sequence was, how are we doing more generally on this 5-year journey, whatever it is? What are the key areas where we need to course correct? How's the market shifted, et cetera? And then those are inputs that really flow into, the more detailed, I guess, budget planning.
Yeah, that's exactly the right sequence. It reminds me of, GE used to have so-called session 1, which was basically a longer-term strategy look, feeding into session 2, which was the annual operating plan, feeding into board discussion and all that. That's and together with that, a talent review. We'll come back on that. It's just I want to talk about the committees. Now that we've gotten over the hurdle of saying, you got to have a board, you have to have a board chairman with some kind of agenda, some kind of frequency, some kind of rhythm. You need to have committees, and I think for me at least, it depends on the business. I find that transaction intensive businesses, and certainly consumer business with lots of receivable cash coming in and revenue sources, and similarly on the buy side, with a complex supply chain and many vendors, any sort of very intensive transaction businesses would benefit from having an audit committee because there's just too much opportunity for things to cash to leak and bad things to happen. But I think that doesn't necessarily apply to maybe longer cycle B2B businesses that are much more revenue or cost concentrated. I think the other one is human capital broadly, and maybe the narrow case of that is the compensation committee for the CEO and their direct reports. If you want to alignment, and here we're setting equity aside, just thinking about fixed versus variable compensation for the year and how that aligns to objectives that are underwritten and that are baked into the plan, and how that cascades going to be just one level from the CEO down. That's something that has merit. And then, more broadly than compensation is maybe once or twice a year looking at like succession planning, retention risk, this sort of human capital topic. I think finally, increasingly these days in almost every business, there is a digital element. And, for a lot of more mature businesses with mature management teams and, mature governance, you need to have a kind of injection of younger talent that is savvy about, how broadly, IT, use a broader sense of the word, is transforming businesses in every sense. And that could be, it depends on the business again, but, anything from just the enterprise IT rollout agenda to how, the customer experience in, non-face-to-face to artificial intelligence, AI is on everybody's lips these days. And, depending on the business, but I think that's increasingly becoming almost a must-have as a special session of the board because it has such implications for. But those would be kind of 3 areas I think, in many cases, are warranted.
Yeah, and I think the way you just phrased that, these are topics or sessions. So whether or not it's formally constituted as a committee, I think that is situational, like you say. But at the very least, right, there needs to be a process, a board-run process, to review and sign off on the audit that invariably will happen, right, on, when you're closing the books on a fiscal year. There will, I think, there's definitely a need for some sort of at least once a year, aligning human capital and organization and incentives with, the value creation plan, whether that needs to be reviewed by a subset of the board as a committee or not, I think is situational. And to your last point, what are the digital ramifications of the changing marketplace or the digital ramifications of our plan, and whether we've got the right board membership to help navigate that. But I think whether or not you constitute the committee, I think depends a bit on the size of the business, depends to some extent on the exit plan. So if we know that a business is destined for an IPO, you probably do want to bake in more of these kind of native capabilities around running an audit function, et cetera. Whereas if you're going to be pursuing like a secondary or something, it may be less critical.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Thank you for saying that, because I can think of the audit committee that I chaired once in one of my companies. This is a very transaction intensive business, but we actually formally constituted a committee if for no other reason that we thought we were thinking ahead to exit and how we wanted to look to have this, audit function tied to an auditor. And there the audit, it was audit and risk management. So it's the auditing of the financials, but it's also the building in place of controls. Because again, these transactions in the business have just so much opportunity to leak cash, and so. But we actually set that up. Again, partly is window dressing and partly is good housekeeping. I think in terms of the, like you said, it's whether you have a committee or you have a special session or whatever, audience is important. If you're talking about the CEO's compensation, that should be there shouldn't be a lot of people in the room, put it that way, in that discussion. Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's the venue or the modality of this committee is maybe of secondary importance, but it's the topicality, or if that's a word, the urgency or the relevance of these will of course depend on the company and their situation. So anything else on the committee topic? Speaking of board roles generally, and I've seen situations where you have identified, I think the American term ombudsman, the idea of a safe, trusted channel for would-be whistleblowers in your company to raise compliance issues of various kinds: legal compliance, regulatory compliance, outright stealing from the company, sexual harassment, racial bias, whatever it is. I think the board often can play that role well, separating that from management and having that person to be a non-executive director. I've seen that work in two cases, well. And then you mentioned about the engagement of another kind of service the board can play. You mentioned about the dinners with the management team. I think that's a good thing. I'd go even further and say, a couple of boards I've seen, there was a practice that for 2 or 3 days before the board meeting, we'd actually sort of drop the non-executive folks on the board into the company to spend some one-on-one time sitting in meetings or meeting with principals down 1 or 2 levels, and just kind of getting into the thick and pressing the flesh. I think that's a good practice as well. And then like town halls, especially in the beginning, where you're really communicating the change, and a new financial sponsor coming in, having certainly the board chairman attend those. That's another way of engaging, beyond the board meeting as well.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking, those are all good ways of kind of pressure testing just how paranoid the CEO might be.
That never happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are, like, in the abstract, they're all great, and I think well-intentioned board directors, sitting in on meetings is fine. I think it is important, and I found, especially, I guess, in some of the markets that we used to operate in, just like the importance of kind of hierarchy was such that these were sometimes treacherous waters. to kind
Yeah.
of navigate. And the nice thing about dinners and that kind of it kind of creates this safe space where somehow it's kind of like removed from the day to day of the business, and those concerns kind of get put to the side a little bit. And I think it goes to another point that I wanted to bring up was around kind of just the running of the meetings, and like the materials and like the idea of pre-circulating materials, I think is essential. But also the other way around for the board directors to, feed back to the management, like here are some questions and areas that we want to drill into on the basis of having read the materials. So that everybody's kind of going into the sessions with as much advanced knowledge. And this is building up to something. So the other thing is that, like, pre the board meeting, ideally there's like a meeting of just the non-executives where the board chair ideally is like aligning like the key messages that the board wants to send to the CEO and to management. Because otherwise what happens is, people just kind of react in real time. And the unwitting outcome of that is just kind of a scattershot range of different, action items and requests and questions. Whereas, a chairperson really worth their salt is kind of going to want to shape the discussion and focus the discussion on, like, what are the couple of things that we really want management to take away and it's really going to move the needle. And so to me, like, that gets baked into an effective board meeting and an effective communication process, starting from the materials and kind of just managing that, managing the conversation around the board meeting. And so the reason why I brought that up at this point was, again, if you've got people like sort of floating around the business, it's not unreasonable for a CEO to get concerned, not because they're paranoid necessarily, but because just like consistency of messaging and keeping people like on target and not distracted is like such a struggle, it's such a day-to-day struggle. Anyway, I just want to put that out there as something that I've seen go haywire, more than once.
Yeah, no, I have too. And I think it's a great ad. What I would say is it depends on this phenomenon of depositing folks into the business from a board depends on two considerations. One is, the trust and EQ kind of skills of the various parties have to be such that that independent, it could be somebody from the sponsor or an outsider, but they have to clearly understand that their role is not to not to provide direction in any way, even this reinforcing of the CEO's direction, not providing direction, but to gather deeper insight. And this leads me to my second reason why or second circumstance that makes that work, is where that sponsor person or independent person is actually in a lane where they're helping in a more substantial way than just sitting in the board meetings and as a kind of a wallflower. But you and I both know that you have both independent board members and you have sponsor folks who are actually, for some period of time, have their sleeves rolled up and are working on something of substance. And they clearly have to, be out there engaging and not just having it, focus with the CEO. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly a trust element that has to be done, I think, very, thoughtfully all around.
Well, it reminds me of actually the one board that you and I served together on. And you played that role, I thought, quite effectively, with your kind of functional depth in the area of procurement. And you were working directly with, teams a couple layers into the organization. But as I remember it, like those were very well-defined projects. They almost had like charters around them. And it was very clear and pre-aligned with the CEO, like who was going to be on this like task force, like to what end, and you were going to report back to the board, or the team was going to report back to the board, like that kind of structure that gave clarity around, like what we're doing, how we're going to do it, to what end, I think was an effective way of kind of managing some of the other, because otherwise the ambiguity becomes quite difficult to manage.
Yeah. Well, it's a special circumstance, and you're absolutely right. But that for me is having a lane, having a role to play in the business that's very explicit, and it can't be this kind of shadow thing. But speaking of shadow, you mentioned the concept of the meeting, the pre-meeting before the board, which I think normally is by design with no management. It's certainly not CEO. No, if no management, then nobody.
Yeah, we called it a non-executive session.
Yeah, exactly. I've seen those for two reasons. One is the one you mentioned is sort of choreographing key messaging, so there's not a kind of Indian opera effect that I've seen as well in board meetings.
I've got to go watch one of these Indian operas. That's the second time you've mentioned these.
It's something to behold. Well, I mean, a lot of Indian companies are very operatic by nature, but so that's certainly one. And the other is sometimes there's a CEO crisis. I mean, the CEO is fundamentally steering the wrong direction, or there's some compliance questions around the CEO, or the CEO is basically radioactive to some degree. And I think that's important to huddle. And of course, the CEO is going to be very paranoid about that. So that type of meeting has to happen, in kind of, deep secrecy. That's something else that I find that this has to happen from time to time. Before we, kind of wrap up, I mean, there are lots of things to talk about. We haven't talked about compensation. And here we're talking about non-management folks. Very often for the sponsor people, that's just kind of goes with the territory. But independents obviously need to be rewarded for their time. You've seen numbers all over the place. I mean, the fixed fees kind of don't really matter. What's more interesting is variable and/or equity type of compensation, including opportunities to co-invest. I think the ideal world is you have folks on the board who are there for the duration, who really bring something, with industry or functional, whatever thing that they're there to contribute, and that are as invested as a sponsor and their folks, as a co-investor, or maybe receiving some equity in lieu of cash, some kind of trade-off there, where there's fundamentally some at-risk sense. I think that is an important consideration. The fixed fees, you've seen them. I mean, it depends on how much time they ultimately spend, but there's sort of you shouldn't be paying an outside director who's just doing the board meetings $250,000. But yeah, you get that's what probably Apple and GE pays their board members. But I think in the kind of scale of companies we have, I mean, it's more like $100K or something like that, in that neighborhood. Again, much more important is the at-risk compensation, skin in the game, maybe some variable compensation depending on if they're engaged in some lane. Any thoughts you want to share on compensation for outsiders?
Yeah, no, I guess it is those few buckets. I mean, we were very partial to the idea of having our directors and certainly our chairs co-invest in our deals. Yep. In a lot of cases, the way it turned out as the program kind of evolved, because like I said earlier, we were kind of recycling. That's a terrible word to use. We were like deploying chair people against several deals, like in succession. And so they were very much known entities. In some cases, they became quite, they were able to roll over, kind of like
repurposing.
That's even better. Yeah, that's better. But so they were able to actually, do some meaningful co-investing. And typically the way we would do it, our ideal structure was they have, an amount that they're putting up as a co-invest, and then we would typically like match that with an equity grant that was treated very much like carry was, for members of the GP on a no fee basis. So it was quite attractive, for these non-executives to co-invest. There's obviously the tax benefits as well of, being able to point to carry as an investment outcome rather than as some form of compensation. So what we didn't do a lot with actually was variable compensation that wasn't some sort of equity related, grant. We didn't give bonuses to our non-execs. The thinking being that their bonus came at exit, with performance of the investment. But you just said something interesting that I want to hear more about. So like if you had non-executives working on a specific lane or something, maybe that's a better area to think about some form of bonus structure.
Well, that's only what I was thinking about. Is I've been in situations where I was in a lane driving it in a portfolio company as an independent and had a bonus tied to some outcomes related to that lane. But that's, I agree. That's more unusual. Yeah. Ultimately, you pay people for their time, because their time is valuable. But ultimately the real value is at exit and having that compensated through equity that ultimately aligns everybody.
Yeah.
I think that we covered a lot of ground. I mean, I think the one other thing I'd say, board responsibility. We talked about the budget. I think that you want to have boards that have certain authority in a very limited sense, especially capex, where and very often, I'm sure you've had this experience at the beginning of a buyout situation. You actually build a table of authorities. Yes. Where you're delegating responsibility and authority to approve certain OPEX or CAPEX above certain thresholds. And then, the board does have some role to play at some point, based on, we would agree that's
that's something that we did sort of up front, like to the extent that we were going to be putting together committees as well. We had like templates for committee charters, but one of the templates that we used with every board was like the sign off and authorization limit document, the contents of which were tailored to the industry and the specific deal. But the basic idea being, CapEx expenditures above a certain threshold, sign off around budgets, and we would articulate that. Veto rights for certain key executive roles. We retained those.
Okay.
We had, and there was a template that we used with all of our deal teams it was like one of the things that we would do on day one, basically.
Yeah, exactly. That's when you want to do it. Okay, good. Well, look, I think we certainly touched on most of the topics I had in the agenda. Anything else you want to wrap up with?
I think that covers a lot of it. I think that maybe one of just reflecting in real time on the conversation we've just had. I think like the trick to getting like 80% of this right is having the right individuals in those key roles, whether it's chair or whether it's CEO. And that's one of the ones where I think there's equal components, art and science, to getting that right. And but maybe that's something that we tackle in an episode coming up real soon.
Yeah, no, I mean, this whole EQ element and maturity and style is so important whenever you're talking about this level of responsibility and where there's some risk of ambiguity vis-a-vis the authority of the CEO, and that's why I'm and I love all my young people I've worked with, but very often young folks just don't have that yet, and they can create some confusion in some cases. So, but I like that. I mean, that goes to the territory. You took your young people well. They need to have EQ skills as well as being brains on a stick. Very important. Excellent. Well, listen, I think great discussion. I love these, and hopefully the audience will as well. And I think we can wrap up now.
Thank you, Carlos.
Be sure to like, subscribe, and
there you go.
Hit the alert bell and comment. Most important. All right. Nino, talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Carlos.
Cheers.